The ascetic Gautama has no superhuman state. He teaches a Dhamma hammered out by reasoning. Okay, imagine dedicating your whole life to a spiritual teacher only to turn around and publicly declare that they're basically faking the whole thing, that they actually have no profound insight, no supreme enlightenment, and they're really just an ordinary guy making educated guesses. Well, that stinging insult is exactly how our source material kicks off today. It was thrown at the Buddha by a former disciple named Sunakkhatta, and it completely sets the stage for what becomes one of the most epic, awe-inspiring rebuttals in ancient history.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating text known as the Mahāsīhanāda Sutta, or the Great Discourse on the Lion's Roar. Now, this isn't just some dusty ancient script. It's an absolute masterclass in defending ultimate wisdom. For those of you who love focused, efficient deep dives, you're in for a real treat. We're going to see exactly how the Buddha systematically dismantled this critique, step by step.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll be hitting 1. The skeptic's bold challenge. 2. Powers and unshakable fearlessness. 3. Mapping the 5 destinations. 4. Surviving extreme ascetic practices. And finally, 5. The hair-raising final roar. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. The Skeptic's Bold Challenge.
To really understand the tension here, we have to look at the setting. The text tells us we're in the bustling city of Vesali. The Buddha's chief disciple, Sariputta, is just out collecting alms when he catches wind of a pretty disturbing rumor. Sunakkhatta, a monk who had recently abandoned the order, is out there actively slandering the Buddha in public. And this illustrates the core conflict perfectly. On one hand, you have Sunakkhatta claiming the Buddha's just a normal guy guessing at the truth. On the other, the reality of a master who possesses supreme, superhuman insight. So Sariputta reports this slander back to the Buddha. But instead of getting defensive or angry, you know what the Buddha does? He uses it as the perfect opportunity to roar his spiritual supremacy.
Moving on to Section 2. Powers and unshakable fearlessness.
So instead of getting defensive, the Buddha calmly lays out his absolutely overwhelming arsenal of insight. The source actually lists 10 specific powers of a Tathagata, but these 3, they perfectly capture the superhuman scale of his awareness. He tells Sariputta that he can flawlessly read the minds and mental states of others. He can recall not just 1 or 2, but literally thousands of past lives spanning across eons of cosmic expansion and contraction. And perhaps most mind-blowing of all, he possesses what's called the divine eye. It's this unclouded vision that lets him see exactly how the actions of all beings dictate their future fates.
And here's the crucial takeaway from all this. Because of these incredible powers, the Buddha possesses 4 kinds of absolute fearlessness. The text calls this the Vesaraja Dhamma. Essentially, he is completely immune to being challenged on his enlightenment, the destruction of his mental impurities, his knowledge of what blocks spiritual progress, and his flawless path to liberation. He confidently declares that he sees absolutely no ground for anyone, whether that's a human, a god, or even a demon, to legitimately refute his mastery. Because he has this certainty, he lives perfectly safe, totally fearless, and boldly turns the Brahma wheel of his teachings.
Section 3. Mapping the 5 destinations.
Now, to prove he isn't just making educated guesses, the text uses incredibly vivid metaphors to show how he maps out the universe. The Buddha explains exactly how he sees the trajectory of every single being. For instance, a life heading toward hell, it's like an exhausted, scorched man walking down a single path straight into a deep pit of glowing, smokeless coals. An animal rebirth is likened to walking straight into a deep pit of dung. The ghost realm is like a sparse tree in rough terrain that barely gives any shade. Meanwhile, the human realm is compared to a thick, shady tree offering real comfort. And heaven, or ultimate liberation, nirvana, that's like an exhausted traveler finally arriving at a magnificent palace, or a cool, refreshing lotus pond where they can just wash away all their suffering.
The text goes out of its way to emphasize that with his divine eye, he doesn't just guess where a person might end up, he can actually look into their mind, see the exact path of actions they're walking on right at that moment, and predict with absolute 100% certainty which of those metaphorical destinations they're going to arrive at. There is zero guesswork here. His vision is absolute.
Let's head into Section 4. Surviving extreme ascetic practices.
To completely dismantle the accusation that he hasn't achieved anything extraordinary, the Buddha shifts his tone drastically. He starts recounting his own horrifying history of extreme self-mortification before he attained enlightenment. He details how he mastered 4 absolute extremes: asceticism, which meant severe starvation and agonizing physical postures; Coarseness, where he let years and years of dirt and grime build up on his body until it literally looked like the cracked bark of an old tree. Scrupulousness, where he was so terrified of accidentally harming a microscopic creature in a drop of water that he was constantly paralyzed by anxiety. And finally, seclusion, where he lived in terrifying, freezing forests, running away from the sight of other humans like a frightened wild deer.
And we really need to emphasize just how intense this got. At his absolute breaking point, trying to literally force spiritual purity through sheer physical suffering, the text records that he survived on just a single grain of rice, a single jujube fruit, or a single bean per day. He even resorted to eating his own waste.
The source material gives us these deeply visceral details of the shocking physical toll it took on him. He says that his eyes sank so far into his skull they looked like the reflection of stars at the bottom of a deep, dry well. When he reached out to touch his stomach, he actually grabbed his spine. His ribs jutted out like the rotting rafters of an old roofless barn. And simply trying to rub his own limbs to soothe the ache, that caused his rotting body hair to literally fall right out of his skin.
So this raises the ultimate question, right? Did nearly starving himself to death, enduring freezing winters totally naked, and brutally punishing his physical body actually lead him to enlightenment? Was this the grand secret to the ultimate truth?
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the hair-raising final roar. Let's see the Buddha's answer to that very question.
The answer is a resounding absolute no. The text explicitly tells us that despite enduring this unmatched, grueling physical punishment, the Buddha realized it was completely useless for attaining true liberating insight. He pushed the absolute limits of physical human endurance and discovered that suffering just for the sake of suffering does not equal profound wisdom. The middle way, the path he ultimately championed, was actually born out of the complete failure of these extremes.
Building on that revelation, he systematically dismantles the theories of other ancient thinkers. He makes it crystal clear that true purity doesn't come from just changing your diet. It doesn't come from waiting around and wandering aimlessly in the cycle of rebirth. It definitely doesn't come from being born into specific high realms. And it certainly does not come from conducting physical rituals like fire sacrifices. Purity comes solely from supreme wisdom and insight.
To really drive the point home against Sunakkhatta's initial insult, the Buddha proudly declares the enduring, untouchable power of his mind. He points out that even at 80 years old, an age where the human body naturally starts to fail, his mind remains as incredibly sharp, infallible, and powerful as an expert archer who can effortlessly shoot a light arrow straight across the shadow of a palm leaf. Physical aging, he argues, has absolutely zero effect on his boundless, superhuman wisdom.
The sheer force and majesty of this defense was so overwhelming that a disciple named Nagasamala, who had literally been standing there fanning the Buddha during this entire discourse, gets full-body goosebumps. He tells the Buddha that the teaching is so astonishing, his hair is standing on end. Because of this wild reaction, the Buddha officially names this teaching the Mahāsīhanāda, the hair-raising discourse.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer. We've mapped out the Buddha's flawless defense of his own enlightenment, tracing the journey from a skeptic's stinging insult all the way to a literal hair-raising roar of ultimate wisdom. And it leaves us with a deeply provocative final thought, based directly on his rejection of extreme asceticism. If the greatest sage in history realized through a near-death experience that extreme suffering does not equal wisdom, where in your own life might you be confusing useless hardship with actual meaningful progress? Thanks so much for exploring this explainer with me today, and keep seeking that clarity.